The air was thick with it, this taste of dust and cordite and something else, something sour that was just despair. You could taste it on the back of your tongue, a metallic kind of fear that never really went away, not since the rumble started in the east and just kept getting louder. That was the worst sound, that low, grinding thunder of the Soviet artillery, the Stalin orgel we called it, the Stalin's organ, because the rockets screamed like some hellish church music. It had been getting closer for hours, drowning out the other sounds, the ones you were supposed to be listening for, the moans of the wounded, the raspy breathing of a kid with a punctured lung, the soft prayers of a man who knew his ticket was probably punched. This wasn't a proper hospital, not by a long shot. It was a shell of a farmhouse, somewhere east of the Oder, the walls pockmarked with bullet holes and one whole corner blown out so the cold, damp air just seeped in. We de-set up in what was probably the main living area, the floorboards sticky with things I don't like to remember, the smell of blood and antiseptic and unwashed bodies so strong it was a physical presence. I was a sanitator, a medic, and my world had shrunk down to this one room, to the faces of the men laid out on stretchers or just on dirty blankets on the floor. My hands were raw, chapped from the cold, and from the constant washing in water we had to boil over a shaky little stove. My uniform was stained dark in places, and my head felt like it was full of wet wool from too many hours without sleep. You stop counting the days after a while, you just count the breaths, the heartbeats of the guy you're trying to patch up. The order came down from the Hauptmann, his face grim and streaked with dirt. "We're pulling back. Now." He didn't have to say it. We could all hear. The thunder wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was the house next door shaking, plaster dust sifting down from the ceiling like snow. The rifle fire was getting crisp, individual pops becoming a ragged chorus. The Russians were coming, and they were coming fast. The order was the one we all dreaded. We had to decide who we could move and who we had to leave behind. There's no good way to say it. You look at a man, you look at his wounds, and you make a calculation no 20-year-old should ever have to make. Can he survive the jostling of a cart or being carried? Will he bleed out if we move him? Is he too far gone? It's a horrible, cold math that sits in your gut like a stone. We started grabbing the ones who could walk, the ones with arm wounds, helping them up, pushing them towards the door where a couple of carts were waiting. The moans of the ones we were leaving got louder, more frantic. They knew. A hand would grab my ankle as I passed, a desperate grip, and I'd have to pry the fingers loose, mumble something useless like, "We'll be back for you." But we all knew it was a lie. The worst part was destroying the medical supplies we couldn't carry, smashing bottles of morphine, pouring out the precious alcohol, tearing apart the last of the clean bandages. It felt like a sin. Every smashed ampule was a life we might have saved later, but the order was clear: leave nothing for the Ivans. The taste in my mouth wasn't just dust anymore. It was the taste of giving up, of admitting that it was all over. And that's when I saw him. In the corner, propped up against a shattered wardrobe, was France, my France. We, grown up together in the same little village near Köln, fished in the same creek, gotten into the same trouble. He joined up a week before I did, all full of fire and talk of glory. That fire had been gone from his eyes for a long time, but now there was something else, a flat, dull acceptance. The wound was bad. A piece of shrapnel had torn into his lower abdomen, and even with the field dressing I'd applied earlier, the seepage was dark, ominous. I knew that kind of wound. I'd seen it too many times. Gut shot. There was no coming back from that, not here, not now. He looked at me, and he knew I knew. "Hey, Klaus," he whispered, his voice raspy. He tried to smile, but it was just a twitch of his lips. Sounds like the party's starting without us. I knelt down beside him, the chaos of the evacuation fading into a dull roar in the background. It was just him and me, like when we were kids hiding in our fort in the woods. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Just a bit of noise, France, will be all right." The lie came easily, automatically. He shook his head slightly, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Don't bother with the pretty lies, not now." He closed his eyes for a second, gathering his strength. "Is it bad, really?" I just nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight. He nodded back, understanding passing between us like it always had. That's when I remembered it. The chocolate bar. It was a small thing, a Swiss milk chocolate bar I'd been hoarding in the inside pocket of my tunic for weeks. I was saving it for my birthday, which was still a few days off. It had become this little secret talisman, this promise of a future moment of sweetness. a tiny piece of the world before all this madness. I'd feel its shape through the fabric sometimes, a hard, square reminder that there was still such a thing as chocolate, as birthdays, as normal life. My fingers were trembling as I fished it out. The wrapper was a little crumpled, but the red foil was still bright. France's eyes widened a fraction when he saw it. Chocolate was a memory from another lifetime. "What's that?" He breathed. "You've been holding out on me, you old dog." "For a special occasion," I said, my voice rough. I carefully unwrapped it. The smell hit me first, rich and sweet, a smell that belonged to cafes and home and Christmases, not this charnel house. I broke it in half. The snap was clean and loud, a ridiculously normal sound amidst the bedlam. I gave one half to France. His hand was cold when our fingers touched. He took it, just holding it for a moment, looking at it like it was some kind of miracle. Then he put it in his mouth. I did the same. The taste, God, the taste. It was so overwhelmingly sweet, so creamy and rich, it was almost painful. It was a physical shock to the system. For a few seconds the world disappeared. There was no roar of artillery, no smell of blood, no cold floor beneath my knees. There was just this incredible, profound sweetness spreading across my tongue, a direct line back to everything we had lost. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the metallic fear I'd been tasting for days, to the coppery taste of blood that seemed to linger in the air. France closed his eyes as he let it melt in his mouth. And then he smiled. A real smile, not the ghost of one. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and for just a fleeting second, he wasn't a dying soldier in a ruined farmhouse in Poland. He was the boy I'd known my whole life, the one who laughed easily and was always planning some new adventure. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated peace, a moment of shared humanity in the middle of all that hell. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. We just sat there, two friends sharing a piece of chocolate as the world fell apart around us. He finished his half and let out a long, slow breath. That was good, Klaus, thank you." He leaned his head back against the wardrobe, the smile still softening his face. His breathing shallowed, became more ragged. I held his hand. I just sat there, holding the hand of my oldest friend, watching the life fade from him. The sounds of our retreating unit grew fainter, the squeak of the cart wheels, the tramp of boots, until they were gone. The Soviet artillery had stopped, too. They were close now, so close we could hear shouted commands in Russian, the crunch of boots on the frozen ground outside. The silence that fell over the farmhouse was eerie, more frightening than the noise. It was a heavy, waiting silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the other wounded men we'd left behind. The fighting had passed over us. We were in the eye of the storm. I was still holding France's hand when his breathing stopped. There was no last dramatic word, no final gasp. It just stopped. The silence fell over him, too. I felt the last bit of warmth leave his fingers. I laid his hand gently on his chest and sat back on my heels. The sweet taste of the chocolate was still there in my mouth, but now it was mixing with something else, a bitter aftertaste. The knowledge that this was it. The war was over for me, not with a bang, but with this terrible, quiet stillness. I wasn't a fighter anymore. I was a caretaker for the dead and dying, and my weapon was surrender. I heard the boot steps then, heavy and purposeful, coming up the steps to the farmhouse porch. The door, already hanging off one hinge, was kicked inward with a splintering crash. They filled the doorway, these figures in long, brownish coats, their faces hard and young under their helmets, their PPSH submachine guns held at the ready. They swept the room with their eyes, taking in the scene, the destruction, the abandoned medical gear, the bodies on the floor. One of them, an officer maybe, barked a question in Russian. I didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. I slowly, very slowly, raised my hands. I stood up, my joints aching. I wasn't afraid for myself, not really. The fear had been burned out of me, replaced by a numb, hollow feeling. My only thought was for the men on the floor. I had to stay with them. Surrendering wasn't about saving my own skin. It was about not leaving them alone in their last moments. It was the last duty I could perform. As they gestured for me to move outside with the barrels of their guns, I instinctively shoved my hand into my pocket. My fingers closed around the empty chocolate wrapper. I didn't take it out. I just held it, crumpled in my fist. That's what remained. Not the chocolate, but the wrapper. That little piece of red foil. It wasn't a token of the last meal. It was a token of the last act of kindness I was able to give. It was France's smile. That's what I carried with me, not the bitter aftertaste or the cold fear, but the memory of his face in that one peaceful moment. They marched us away, a small, ragged column of the walking wounded and those of us who had stayed behind. I didn't look back at the farmhouse. I didn't need to. I carried it all with me. That empty wrapper stayed in my pocket through the long march east, through the processing camp, through the years in the camp. I'd touch it sometimes, feel its crinkly texture, and for a second I'd be back there, tasting that impossible sweetness, seeing my friends smile. It was a weight, that memory, a heavy stone of grief, but it was also a comfort. It reminded me that even at the very end we were still human. We could still share a piece of chocolate. In the camps, when the hunger was a sharp-toothed animal in your belly and the cold felt like it would freeze your soul solid, I'd think about that chocolate. I'd realized that the war, for all the grand speeches and the moving of armies on maps, wasn't fought that way for guys like me. It was fought bite by bite, moment by moment. It was a shared cigarette in a muddy foxhole, a letter from home read aloud by candlelight, a dirty joke that made you laugh when you thought you forgotten how. It was holding your friend's hand as he left this world and giving him one last taste of sweetness. That's what got you through. Not the ideology, not the fatherland, but the guy next to you. And sometimes, if you were lucky, a small piece of chocolate. You get a feeling for it after a while, a certain tightness in the air, a quiet that's heavier than any shelling. The pocket was shrinking again, that's what the officers called it, a nice clean word for being squeezed to death. We'd been in the East long enough, my lot, the ones with the 1,000-yard stares and the crust of 2 Russian winters frozen into our bones. We knew the drill. It wasn't a surprise anymore, just a grim, tired acceptance. Like a toothache you've had for so long you almost forget what it's like not to feel it. But the new ones, the replacements, God, they were just boys. Their uniforms were still stiff, their faces still had a bit of softness to them, and their eyes were wide with a raw, animal fear that we'd all burned through months ago. We were on fumes, but these kids were on pure panic, and you could smell it on them, a sour scent of sweat and desperation. Then the order came down the line, passed from foxhole to foxhole in a low murmur, consume all remaining rations. Nobody said it, but we all knew what that meant. It's not an order for an advance, it's not an order for a retreat. It's the last call. It means there's no supply coming, no breakfast tomorrow. It means stand and die, or lay down your arms and live, if you can call what comes next living. So we rooted through our packs, pulling out the last tins, the hard bread that could break a tooth if you weren't careful. I had a tin of pea soup, the usual grey-green glop. I found a spot behind a shattered wall, out of the wind, and got a small, mean little fire going, just a handful of damp twigs that smoked more than they burned. My hands were steady as I set the tin on a rock near the flames. They knew this routine. Next to me, a kid, couldn't have been more than 18, was trying to do the same, but his hands were shaking so bad he almost dropped his tin into the mud. I saw him fumble with his matches, his breath coming in quick, ragged little puffs. He was trembling all over, a leaf in a storm. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? Don't worry, son, it'll be over soon. That was the problem. It was going to be over soon. I just nudged my tin closer to the heat and waited. The soup began to simmer, little plops and bubbles breaking the surface. It didn't smell like food. It smelled like wet wool and defeat. When it was warm enough, I used a rag to pick it up and took a sip. It tasted like ashes, like surrender. It was the exact same taste I had in my mouth outside Stalingrad, that metallic, hopeless flavor that coats your tongue when you know the game is up. It's not a taste you forget. The kid was just staring into his tin, not eating. He looked green. I lit a cigarette, the last one in my pack, and took a long, deep drag, feeling the smoke burn down into my lungs, a familiar, selfish comfort. I saw him watching me, and without a word I handed it over. Our fingers brushed, his ice-cold against my grimy ones. He took it with a nod, a quick, jerky movement, and inhaled like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Maybe it was. That was the conversation. There were no grand speeches, no talk of fatherland or honor. That stuff was for the propaganda company boys far behind the lines. Out here, it was all in the nod, in the shared cigarette, in the silence that said more than any speech ever could. We were in the shit together, and that was the only fellowship that mattered anymore. I broke my chunk of black bread in half. It was hard as a brick. I held out half to the kid. He looked at me, confused. Eat it, I grunted, not unkindly, but not kindly either. It wasn't about kindness. It was a transaction. I was giving him my appetite for hope, because mine was long gone. I had no stomach for it anymore, no belief in a tomorrow where this bread would matter. He needed that blind faith more than I did. He took it and nibbled at the edge, his eyes welling up. I looked away, giving him that much dignity. I finished my soup, scraping the tin clean with my finger. The warmth in my belly was a lie. It was just a temporary weight against the hollow feeling that was growing inside, an emptiness that had nothing to do with hunger. This was it. The fight was over. And a strange thing happened then, a feeling I'm ashamed to admit even now, but it was there. A quiet, profound relief. The pressure was off. The waiting was over. No more listening for the whistle of a mortar, no more straining your eyes into the darkness, no more wondering if the next second would be your last. The decision had been made for us. Surviving was no longer about fighting, it was just about enduring. Then we heard the sounds, not the crump of artillery or the ripping burst of a machine gun. This was a new sound, a sound that was somehow louder and more final than any explosion. It was the clatter of rifles and machine pistols being thrown onto a growing pile. A dull, metallic thudding, one after another, the sound of purpose being discarded. It was the most definitive sound of the war for me. It's the sound I still hear sometimes. We stood up slow like old men. I tossed my own rifle onto the pile. It felt like throwing away a part of my own body, but a part that was sick and poisoned. The weight lifted from my shoulders was replaced by a different, heavier weight in my soul. The Ivans were coming out of the tree line now, their padded jackets making them look huge, their PPSH submachine guns held at the ready. Their faces were grim, exhausted too. They'd been on the other side of this hell, but it was the same hell. They just herded us together, not with cruelty, but with a weary efficiency. They'd done this before. We started to march, a long, ragged column of grey shuffling through the mud. My stomach felt hollow again, the meager soup already just a memory. The emptiness was back, but it was different now, filled with the silence of defeat. I didn't think about home. I didn't think about my family. I didn't even think about what was going to happen next. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean. All the fear, the anger, the longing, the memories, it was all spent, burned up like the last of our rations. There was nothing left. I was a shell, moving forward on pure instinct, one foot in front of the other. The only thing that existed was the back of the man in front of me, the mud sucking at my boots, and the cold, grey sky. I was a soldier no longer. I was just a man marching. And in a way I couldn't explain then and still can't now, for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The map was creased and dirty, smudged with fingerprints, and a little spot of blood I could never quite get off. I'd laid it out on an ammo crate, the wood splintered and rough under my palms, but I wasn't really seeing it as a map anymore. Not really. It had stopped being a plan for victory weeks ago. Now it was just a diagram of our entrapment, a cruel joke drawn in topographical lines and place names that meant nothing. The Ardennes Forest, they called it. To me, it was just a frozen hell of dark pines and deeper shadows, a place where the cold got inside your bones and stayed there, a damp, gnawing chill that no amount of stamping your feet could shake. I traced the line of our supposed advance with a grimy finger, a line that had turned into a noose. The Bostonia salient. The word salient sounded so grand, so strategic, but out here it just meant we were sticking out like a sore thumb, surrounded on three sides by Americans who had more ammunition, more coffee, and more hope than we did. The faces of the men were gathered around me, not saying a word. Young faces, most of them, boys who should have been back on farms or in workshops, their biggest worry a pretty girl or a football match. Now their faces were pinched with hunger and fatigue, smeared with dirt and stubble, and their eyes were fixed on me. Lieutenant. The word felt too heavy for my shoulders. They were looking to me for a decision, for a miracle, and the trust in their eyes felt like a physical weight, 100-pound pack strapped directly to my soul. I had to say the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for 2 days. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick and useless. I cleared my throat, a rasping sound that seemed obscenely loud in the quiet of the command post, which was really just a deeper hole in the ground with a tarpaulin strung over it. Men, I started, and my voice cracked. I tried again. The situation is untenable. Our ammunition is nearly exhausted. We have no communication with command. There will be no relief. I saw the hope drain from their faces like water from a shattered cup. One of the younger ones, Klaus, he couldn't have been more than 18, his lips started to tremble. I had to look away, down at that damned map. I am giving the order. We will cease fire at 800. We will surrender to the Americans. The words tasted like betrayal on my tongue. Not betrayal of the fatherland, or the Furathat nonsense had died in me a long time ago, somewhere between the mud of Russia and the ruins of France. No, this tasted like a betrayal of these boys, of the promise I'd made to myself to lead them well. Surrender. It was the most shameful word a soldier could utter, and I had just condemned us all to it. The silence that followed was worse than any shelling. It was a thick, heavy thing, broken only by the sound of Klaus trying to stifle a sob. Then Sergeant Bauer, an old hand who'd been with me since Normandy, a man with a face like weathered leather, he just nodded slowly. Understood, Herr Lieutenant. And that was it. The decision was made. The weight didn't lift, it just changed shape, from the burden of command to the leaden cloak of shame. After the briefing, the men just stood there, lost. The frantic energy of battle was gone, replaced by a numb stillness. We had a few hours until 800. I looked at Bauer. Sergeant, is there anything left? He knew what I meant. He shook his head, then paused. There's the command post loaf, sir. The one we were saving. He went over to a corner of the dugout and came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle. It was our last loaf of black bread, Kamisbrat, hard as a brick and probably twice as old. It was a symbol of everything we had become, depleted, hardened and stale. I took it from him. The rough cloth was damp from the ground. I unwrapped it, and the smell hit me, that familiar sour smell of rye, a smell that used to mean home, but now just meant survival. The loaf was solid, almost petrified. I didn't have a knife. I just used my hands, gripping it and tearing it apart. It was a struggle. The crust fought back, breaking with a dry, cracking sound. I tore off a piece, a rough, ugly chunk, and handed it to Klaus. His hands were shaking as he took it. Eat, I said, my voice softer than I intended. I went down the line to each of the 7 men left in that hole with me. Bauer, Müller, Schmidt, the twins Hans and Jens, who I could never tell apart, young Klaus and old man Fischer, who had a wife and 3 kids waiting in Hamburg. I handed each of them a piece of that pitiful bread. My fingers were numb with cold, but I felt the brief, fleeting warmth of their hands as they took their share. There were no words. What could we say? This was our last meal as free men, as a unit. This stale bread, which would have been thrown to the pigs back home, was now a sacrament. Müller, ever the pragmatist, pulled a small, dented canteen from his pack. It wasn't water. It was the last of the schnapps, a harsh, clear liquid that burned all the way down. He passed it around, each man taking a small, careful sip. When it came to me, the metal of the canteen was cold against my lips. I took a sip, the alcohol afire in my empty stomach, a brief, false warmth. As I chewed on my own small piece of bread, it was like eating gravel. It was gritty, dry, and it stuck in my throat. But as I looked at these men, these boys, chewing silently, their eyes on the ground, I felt something shift inside me. This act, this simple sharing of our last pitiful ration, felt more meaningful, more honorable than any medal I had ever been awarded. This was what it was all about. Not flags, not politics, but the man next to you. In that moment, the shame began to recede, just a little, replaced by a grim, determined love. 800 came too soon. The grey light of dawn filtered through the pine branches, casting long, skeletal shadows. It was time. I checked my Luger one last time, the cold, familiar weight of it in my hand. Then I ejected the magazine, worked the action to clear the chamber, and handed the magazine and the loose round to Bauer. He pocketed them without a word. I held the pistol by the barrel, the grip pointing away from me, a universal sign of surrender. All right, I said, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. Let's go. Keep your hands high, no sudden movements. We climbed out of the hole, our bodies stiff and aching. The cold air hit me like a physical blow. One by one, we emerged from the earth like ghosts. I went first, my hands raised, the pistol held clumsily by the hot barrel. The others fell in behind me. We must have been a sorry sight. Filthy uniforms hanging off gaunt frames, faces pale and exhausted. We started walking, a slow, shuffling procession out of the woods towards the American lines we knew were just a few hundred meters away. The silence was unbearable. For weeks, the forest had been a cacophony of artillery, machine gun fire, and the screams of the wounded. Now there was nothing. just the crunch of our boots on the frozen snow, the ragged sound of our own breathing. Every shadow behind a tree trunk looked like a sniper. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I expected a shot to ring out at any second, to feel the hot, sharp punch of a bullet. This was the most terrifying walk of my life, worse than charging a position, because now we were completely vulnerable. We had given up our right to fight back. We rounded a bend in the frozen path, and there they were, American soldiers, crouched behind a makeshift barricade of logs and snow. Their uniforms looked clean, warm. I could see the steam from their breath, the wary glint of their helmet liners under the grey sky. I kept my hands high, my fingers stretched wide. "Don't shoot," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "We surrender." An American sergeant stood up slowly. He was a big man with a face that looked just as tired as mine felt. He held his Thompson submachine gun trained on us, but his eyes weren't full of hate. They were just weary. He scanned our ragged group, his gaze lingering on young Klaus, who was trembling visibly. Then his eyes met mine. It was the strangest thing. In that moment I didn't see an enemy. I saw another soldier, another lieutenant probably, another man burdened with the lives of his men. I saw a weary understanding, a shared exhaustion with this whole bloody business. He gestured with the barrel of his Tommy gun. "All right, Krauts, over here, slowly." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. As we shuffled forward, other Americans emerged from their positions, their rifles pointed at us. One of them, a young kid with freckles, stepped forward and carefully took the Luger from my hand. He looked at it with a kind of morbid curiosity before stuffing it in his belt. Another soldier started patting me down, his hands quick and professional. The relief was so profound, it almost buckled my knees. It was over. The shooting, the fear, the responsibility for whether we lived or died in the next minute was over. But warring with that relief was a shame so deep it felt like a physical sickness. I had led my men to this. I had failed. I had surrendered. I looked back at my boys, their hands on their heads now, being searched by the Americans. They looked scared, but they were alive. And I had kept my promise. I had brought them out alive. That thought was the only thing that kept me upright. They marched us back to a collection point, a muddy field already filling with hundreds of other captured German soldiers. The faces were all the same, hollow-eyed, defeated. The Americans processed us with a cold efficiency. They took our belts, our bootlaces, anything we could use to harm ourselves. They herded us into wire cages, like cattle. And through it all, for days, the taste of that last piece of bread stayed with me. It was a phantom taste, a gritty, dry sensation that lingered on my tongue and at the back of my throat. In the POW camp, the food was scarce, an unfamiliar tinned meat that was too salty, a kind of white bread that was strangely soft and sweet. But I could still taste that German black bread. At first, I thought it was the taste of defeat, the final, awful flavor of failure. But as the weeks turned into months in that camp, with its mind-numbing boredom and its quiet despair, the meaning of that taste began to change. It wasn't a reminder of the surrender anymore. It became a reminder of the last moment I was truly responsible for my men. The last moment I was their lieutenant. The taste was the taste of that shared silence, of their rough hands taking the bread from mine, of the look the world ended with a clang, a sound so final it sucked the air right out of your lungs. 1 minute we were the hunter, the Panther's Maybach engine roaring its terrible song, the gears grinding as Klaus wrestled with the sticks, and the next, silence. But it wasn't a quiet silence. It was a deafening one, filled with the echo of that last hit ringing in your ears like a church bell gone mad. The smell hit you first, before your thoughts could even catch up the sharp, acidic bite of cordite mixed with the greasy, metallic scent of hot steel, the kind of smell that gets in the back of your throat and stays there for days. Then came the heat, radiating up from the floor plates, a baking, suffocating warmth that told you the engine block was cooking off just inches below your boots. Someone was cursing, a low, steady stream of profanity that was more a prayer than anything else, and then the engine choked, sputtered, and died. Just like that. In the sudden void, the only sounds were the frantic ticking of the instruments and the slow, mournful ping, ping, ping of the armor plating cooling down, contracting, like our own metal coffin settling into its grave there in some godforsaken Norman field. You could taste the fear then, a copper penny on your tongue, and you could feel it in the pit of your stomach, a cold, hard knot. We were stuck, trapped. 5 men in a steel box that had just become a bull's. We all knew the drill. You don't have to say it. In a disabled tank, you're not a soldier anymore. You're bait, a sitting duck. Held our breath, ears straining against the silence, waiting for the next round to finish us off, for the fire to find the ammunition racks and send us all to kingdom come in a flash of white-hot light. But it didn't come. Seconds stretched into a minute. France, our loader, cracked the hatch just a sliver, just enough to risk a peek. Trees to the left, a hedgerow maybe 100 meters to the rear, he whispered, his voice tight. No infantry, yet. That yet hung in the air thicker than the smoke. So we sat there, in the semi-darkness, the only light coming from the little vision slits, casting bleak, sharp shadows across our faces. The adrenaline that had been screaming through our veins just moments before started to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. And that's when the other hunger started to make itself known. Not the fear, but the real, gut-gnawing emptiness. We'd been in action since dawn, and the field kitchen might as well have been on the moon. My stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing sound in the quiet, and Erich, our radio man, let out a weak chuckle. Quiet down, Willie, you'll give away our position. That was army humor for you, laughing on the way to the gallows. It was Hans, our gunner, who broke the stillness. Always the practical one, Hans. While the rest of us were staring into the gloom contemplating our mortality, he was padding around on the grimy floor of the fighting compartment. What are you doing? Klaus muttered from the driver's seat. Hans didn't answer right away. Then we heard a soft, scraping sound. He held it up, a single, mud-caked potato. It must have rolled loose from a sack weeks ago and been living under the spare track links ever since. It wasn't much to look at, lumpy and covered in dirt, but in that moment it might as well have been a golden apple. We all stared at it, a single potato, for 5 starving men. Hans didn't say a word. He just pulled out his Kampfmesser, that sturdy fighting knife he was so proud of, and wiped the blade on his trouser leg. He held the potato carefully, like a craftsman with a delicate piece of wood, and began to slice it. He wasn't just hacking at it. He was measuring, his brow furrowed in concentration, cutting it into 5 pieces as equal as any man could make them in the Neardark. It was the most absurd, solemn ritual I have ever witnessed. Here we were, seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front, now stuck in Normandy maybe minutes from death, and we were having a church service over a raw potato. He passed the first piece to Klaus, up in the driver's compartment. Klaus took it with a grunt, a quiet dank. Then a piece for France, who nodded, his young face looking even younger in the dim light. Then one for Erich. Erich, the joker, just looked at the pale, raw slice in his palm for a long moment, and for once he had nothing funny to say. Hans handed me my piece. It was cool and firm in my hand, damp from being on the floor. He took the last piece for himself. We sat there, each of us holding our share of this pitiful last meal. There was no toast, no ceremony. We just looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. This was it. This was all there was. I raised the piece of potato to my lips. I bit into it. The crunch was surprisingly loud. The taste was earthy, sharp. Starchy and clean, a shock of something utterly real and alive in that metallic tomb of death. It wasn't good, not like Mutter's roasted potatoes with gravy, God no. It was harsh, but it was food. It was life. As I chewed, feeling the gritty texture against my teeth, I looked around at my crew. At Klaus, who could drive that mammoth Panther like it was a sports car. At France, who could load a 75 Michel in his sleep. At Erich, whose jokes kept us from going mad. At Hans, who was now solemnly chewing his own piece, his eyes meeting mine. We weren't just a crew anymore. We were brothers, bound together by more than just orders or oaths. We were bound by the shared taste of that raw potato, by the shared air in that stinking, hot iron coffin. And in that moment, with the taste of raw earth still on my tongue, the decision was made. It wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. We just looked at each other and we knew. Fighting on was suicide. A heroic death for the fatherland, maybe in the propaganda films. In the real world, it was just a stupid, useless waste. It meant leaving our mothers without sons, our sweethearts without answers. It meant dying for a patch of French dirt that would forget our names by tomorrow. That simple act of sharing, of making sure each man got his equal share, had reminded us of what we were fighting for. Not for some grand ideology, but for the man next to you. For the chance to go home. Hans finally broke the silence. "So," he said, his voice flat, "do we die for a potato or do we live because of it?" Erich managed a ghost of a smile. "I've had worse meals, but I prefer my next one to be cooked." That was all the vote we needed. Klaus unlocked his hatch. I took a deep breath, the air inside tasting of sweat and oil and fear, and pushed open the commander's cupola. The light was blinding. After the oppressive darkness of the tank, the summer sun felt like a physical blow. I squinted, my eyes watering, raising my hands high above my head. The fresh air was so sweet it was painful, filling lungs that had been breathing poison. I climbed out, my legs wobbly, the others following one by one, our hands raised to the sky. We stood there on the scarred green hull of our panther, our home, our prison, blinking in the sunlight like newborn babies. We were scared, yes, terrified of what came next, but we were alive, and we were together. The Americans were cautious, their rifles pointed at us as they moved in. They were just kids like us, their faces grimy and tense. They gestured for us to get down. We did. They searched us, their hands patting us down, taking Hans's beloved knife, my wallet with the picture of Liesel inside. They were rough but not cruel. They were just doing their job the same as we would have done. As they marched us away, I took one last look back at the panther. It looked spent, defeated, a great metal beast brought low. But to me, in that moment, it was more than a tank. It was the place where I'd shared the most important meal of my life. In the POW camp, in the long, boring, hungry days that followed, we talk about it sometimes. Not about the big battles, the charges, the near misses. We talk about the potato. We argue, with the faint smiles of men sharing a precious memory about whose piece was the smallest. Erich would always claim Hans had cut himself the king's share, and Hans would just shake his head with a quiet smile. That shared sliver of raw vegetable became our touchstone. It was what we held on to when the homesickness was a physical ache in our chests, when we wondered if we'd ever see Germany again. It was a memory of our humanity, a tiny, defiant spark of decency in the midst of all that madness. You see, the last meal wasn't about the food. It never is. It's about the hands that pass it to you. It's about hands, carefully measuring each slice. It's about the look in Klaus's eyes when he took his piece. It's about the five of us in the dark, choosing to share what little we had, choosing each other over some abstract idea of glory. That taste, that earthy, sharp, life-affirming taste, is something I carry with me still. It's the taste of brotherhood. It's the taste of choosing to live. And even now, all these years later, when I peel a potato for my wife's stew, I sometimes pause, and I remember. I remember the iron coffin, the ping of the cooling metal, and the five of us, sharing everything we had left in the world. The order came down on a Tuesday, I think, though by then the days had all bled into one long, grey smear of dread. "Use it all up, Schmidt," the sergeant said, his voice gravelly with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. "Every last potato, every bit of that salted pork. We're moving out at first light." And he didn't have to say another word. We all knew what that meant. It wasn't a move forward. It wasn't some tactical repositioning. It was a retreat, a full-scale collapse, and the way the Russian artillery had been creeping closer all week, a sound like the sky itself was tearing apart, we knew a hot meal now was less a comfort and more of a final courtesy, a last supper. And as the company cook, that grim duty fell to me. The kitchen was just a dugout with a canvas tarp strung over it, the earth walls always smelling of damp clay and wood smoke. I remember my hands, chapped and raw from the cold, going through the motions on pure muscle memory, peeling those last few potatoes, the skins coming away in thick, dirty curls. The few slabs of pork were tough and streaked with yellow fat, but when I threw them into the big cast-iron pot with some water and the last of the onions, a scent began to rise that was downright holy. It was the smell of a kitchen, a real kitchen, not this muddy hole in the ground. It was the smell of before. But my mind, it wasn't on the stew. It was reeling, spinning like a top. Every bubble that rose and popped on the surface of that broth felt like another second ticking off, another moment closer to the end. The guilt was a physical weight on my shoulders, heavier than any sack of flour I'd ever hauled. I was making a hot meal, the one thing every soldier dreams of when he's cold and scared and living on hardtack and despair. I was giving them this comfort, knowing full well I was probably sending them into a Russian POW camp with a full belly. It felt like a betrayal, like I was lying to them with every carrot I chopped. The worst part was the hope it would spark. I knew it would. You get so low, so deep in the mud and the fear, that a smell like that, a real stew cooking, it can make you forget, just for a minute, that death is sitting right there in the trench with you. Soon enough, they started to gather. The boys. God, they were just boys. Their faces were gaunt, cheeks hollowed out from weeks on short rations, their uniforms hanging off them like sacks. But when that smell of stew hit them, you could see it, a flicker behind their eyes. It wasn't joy, not quite, but a light, a little spark of humanity coming back. They lined up, mess tins in hand, a quiet, shuffling line. No pushing, no joking yet, just a weary, hungry patience. And then it was my turn. I had to put on the performance of my life. I forced a smile onto my face, a thing that felt like a crack in dry clay. "All right, ladies, line up and look pretty," I called out, my voice sounding falsely hearty in my own ears. Don't worry, I skimmed the bugs out this time. That got a few weak chuckles. Old Schmidt and his terrible cooking, it was a running gag. One of the boys, young Weber, who couldn't have been more than 18, peered into the pot. "Smells almost like my mother, S. Schmidt." And I ladled a generous portion into his tin, the rich, thick stew splattering against the metal. "Well, don't tell her you said that. She'll never forgive me," I said, and winked. The lie of that wink burned right through me. I felt like a fraud, a cheap actor on a stage, serving them a meal that felt more like a last rite. This wasn't nourishment. It was a sacrament before the end. Each ladleful I doled out felt like I was anointing them, marking them for whatever was coming. Disguised as kindness, it was the cruelest thing I'd ever had to do. I exchanged hollow jokes with each man, memorizing their faces as they passed. Muller, with his thick glasses he was always wiping. Hoffman, who had a sweetheart back in Hamburg and showed us her picture so often the edges were soft and blurred. Young Weber, all elbows and Adam's apple, trying so hard to look like a man. I served them all, my smile feeling more and more like a grimace. When the last tin was filled, I finally sat down on an upturned crate with my own portion. I didn't have much appetite. I just watched them. I wanted to burn this scene into my memory, to take a mental photograph of it. They were scattered around in little groups, sitting on the ground, leaning against the muddy walls of the trench. For a few precious minutes, the war disappeared. The constant thunder of the artillery seemed to fade away. All you could hear was the soft clink of spoons on metal, the occasional low murmur of conversation, even a real, honest-to-God laugh from somewhere down the line. It was a moment of pure, stolen normalcy. They were just hungry men enjoying a hot meal. I took a spoonful of the stew myself. I'd worked all day on it, but to me, it tasted like ashes. Literally, like I was eating cold fireplace ashes. Each spoonful was a reminder of my own terrible, crushing powerlessness. I was the cook. My job was to sustain them, to keep them going, and here I was, serving them their last hot meal before they were swallowed up by God knows what. Then young Weber walked over, his mess tin already clean. He had a smudge of broth on his chin. "Thank you, Schmidt," he said, and his voice was so earnest, so full of genuine gratitude. That was really something. He clapped me on the shoulder and walked away. And that gratitude, that simple, heartfelt thanks, it was like a knife twisting right in my heart. I just nodded, couldn't speak around the lump in my throat. If he'd cursed me, it would have been easier. But his thanks, that was the worst part of the whole damn day. Later, when the twilight had deepened into a cold, starless night, I doused the cookfire. The hiss of the water on the embers was a final, sighing sound. The steam rose, carrying with it the last ghost of the stew's smell, mixing with the acrid scent of wet smoke. It hung in the air for a long time, that memory of a good meal, a promise of warmth that was already gone. I stood there in the sudden darkness, my world reduced to the feeling of the cold, damp earth under my boots and that fading smell. The following morning, we knew it was over. We could hear the Ivans, their shouts getting closer, the rattle of their weapons a different, more menacing sound than our own. We had our orders about the equipment. I took my prized possession, my big cast-iron pot, and I smashed it against a rock until it was just a few twisted pieces of metal. I did the same to my ladle, my knives, anything that could be of use. The clatter of that destruction, the ringing, final sound of it, echoed the complete and total shattering of our unit. It was the sound of the end. We surrendered an hour later, a pathetic, ragged group of men, our hands in the air. They came out of the trees. These young Russian soldiers with hard faces, shouting words we didn't understand. And I was captured not as a fighter. I'd hardly fired my rifle in weeks, but as a caretaker. My war ended not with some heroic last stand, not with a bang, but with the memory of that final, uneaten pot of stew that sat in the bottom of the pot, gone cold now, a congealed lump of what might have been. They marched us east, and with every step I thought about those faces in the firelight. I wondered if they remembered the taste of the stew, or if they, like me, could only remember the feeling of what came after. You spend your whole time in this damn war just trying to stay alive, trying to find a little bit of comfort where you can, a dry sock, a warm meal, a laugh with your buddies. And in the end, the thing that haunts you isn't the fighting, it's the silence after the last shot is fired. It's the memory of a simple act of kindness that felt, in your heart, like the worst kind of lie.